All right, so I get the honor of introducing our speaker tonight. So Todd Elliott is actually one of our favorite people in the world, but yes, along with Kelsey, his partner. Yes, and we actually had the honor of hearing this talk up at NEMF, the Northeastern Mycological Federation, not that long ago, but we loved it enough. We said, Todd, would you be willing to come and give it to our club? Because, of course, you guys haven't heard it yet. And I love Todd's trajectory in life. It's one of the more interesting trajectories that I've heard of. I think Sam just gave you a little grief about going around and through the back door, but it's really interesting. So I don't necessarily want to go into all the details, but I do know that. So one thing that's impressive is Todd published his first scientific paper on the cordyceps of the Southeast when he was 14. And then he's worked with so many major researchers so that he's been on 6 continents by now. When I first met him, he'd already been on 5 continents. So that was quite a while ago too. And his interest in the natural world has taken him to all these different places, and his enthusiasm and incredible eye for detail and also thinking about how everything is interrelated has taken him to all these places with these research scientists and then doing research on his own. And he just finished his PhD recently. And it's so funny that the name is University of New England, but it's actually based in Australia. So it's been fun because Jacoby just came to our club today. He's studying fungal ant associations. And then Seth also came today, who has worked with Emma and Gabe at Gowan Family Farms. And so, but it's great to hear Todd talk to anyone who's trying to figure out their trajectory in life. Because there were people at NEMF that I introduced him to who came back and said, thank you so much. Like, I just talked to him for 10 minutes, but it helped me figure out what I'm going to do. Like, that's an amazing, yes, Todd, I know you look worried. That's an amazing skill to have. And so I'm really excited that he's here to talk to us today, and I'll let you have the mic. Oh, yeah, and do you want questions like afterwards or taking breaks and do questions?
How y'all doing this evening? Well, I'm tickled to be here and see if I got this projector working. I'm a little concerned that how many people I may be leading astray with my not so sage wisdom, but my trajectory in the natural world I'm just passionate about all different aspects of the natural world. I love to look at how organisms interact. And tonight I thought we'd talk a little bit about that. And I get really excited. I get really passionate about a lot of these things. And so if I get off on a tangent and y'all are having trouble following, please interrupt me. I love interruptions. I love disturbances. I love understanding things and getting us, because this is as much y'all's talk as it is mine. And so please shout out if you got a question or you need me to repeat something, because that's what we're all here to do, is learn. And if you got tangents, additions, suggestions, other questions, I love it. That's what we're all here to do. So how many of you feel like you're relatively new to mushrooms? All right, and how many of you feel like you got a pretty good handle on your mushrooms and you spent a good number of years looking at them? All right, so we got a mix of things. So I'm going to try to, I feel like a lot of times when you talk about plants, people understand the basics of pollination, the basics of how flowers work or how seeds germinate. But for mushrooms, a lot of that was never covered in general biology in high school. So for those of you that are just getting into it, I want to lay a little bit of groundwork in some basic terms. For some of you, this is going to be old information, but bear with me. We'll get into some of the more novel, interesting, more obscure aspects of this here shortly. Well, thank you all for bearing with me. Can you all hear me all right? What was that? Mycelium. Mycelium. Thank you. I'm glad somebody was paying attention. I was dozing off already. So mycelium. So this is the network that's in the forest around us. It's in the soil. It's in the ground. It's in rotting logs. And this is what makes up most of mushrooms. The fruiting body, which is the part we see above ground, is a small part. And that's just when the mushroom's choosing to reproduce. But this is the heavy lifter in the ecosystems. And it's spread out all through the environment, all around us. And a single strand of this mycelium is called, anybody know? A hyphae or a hypha. And that single strand is basically cells stacked end to end to end. And they're spread out and they're mining nutrients externally. So you and me, we ingest our food, the microbiome inside of us, plus with a little help from our teeth, that basically helps break everything down and then our bodies absorb it. But for fungi, they do it all externally. You can try, some of you that got snacks, you can spit in your bag of chips and stick your fingers in there and see if you can absorb it back through your fingers. That's how the fungi are pulling nutrients out of the environment. All right, but then the next question is, how do spores actually get out into the environment? Let's see, is this clicker actually working? Maybe it's the other clicker.
Oh, that's right. You have more than one up there.
Well, I might be back here. So how do they get out in the environment? Anybody know? There's a hint for those of you that are literate. Spores and fruiting bodies. Okay, and what do we have here? Anybody know this mushroom? It's a little mycena. And what color spores does this mushroom have? Brown, white? Well, there's a good indicator. If you know this group of mushrooms, they have white spores. What we can see right here in the environment, that's a spore print in situ. So these are actually the spores that have fallen out from underneath here, and we can see that they have a white spore deposit, even though this mushroom has what color gills? Orangish, right? So those spores are spreading out to the environment. And all of you, take a minute, take a deep breath. You probably just breathed in hundreds of fungal spores, particularly with a crowd like this, you know. You can click to the next one. So how do the spores get out in the environment? Well, if you flip a mushroom over, you probably see underneath it, it's got gills, pores, or teeth. There's some other structures, but these are the three main structures you're likely to encounter in the environment. Now, why do mushrooms not just make their spores on one flat surface? Surface area, exactly. Somebody said that. So if you think about it, a flat plane, they can only fit so many reproductive surfaces that then can have spores on them. So another thing, let's zoom in a little bit closer. On each of these, let's use a gill, for example. On a gill, imagine that knife blade-like structure sticking out. And then on the blade of that gill, there's something called a basidia. And a basidia, it's a little club-shaped structure. Imagine a baseball bat. And then on the end of the baseball bat, imagine little spikes. Anybody know what those spikes are called? Stigmata. And then on the end of those spikes, you know what there are? Spores. And those are the basidiospores. Now, those spores, as they mature, they start out usually pale and clear, and then they get darker and larger. And some of them stay clear through their whole development, depending on the spore. But they get larger and larger, they hit maturation, and then a little bubble builds up and pressure. And there's this pressure, and it expands and expands and expands under that bubble. Now, who's ever driven a car too fast? All right, two of you. And maybe a roller coaster, you felt that momentum throw you forward. That's a G-force. And that G-force in like a car or a roller coaster is probably 3 or 4. If you're a fighter pilot or an astronaut, you might get exposed to a G-force of 10 or 12. But the G-force of a fungal spore leaving its gill is the greatest G-force known, close to 10,000. Isn't that mind-boggling? When you think about it, a single spore has to punch out through the air, and air actually has a fair bit of resistance. So it punches through that air, but it slows down before it goes smashing into the gill next to it. Because these spores are tiny, they're microscopic. The average spore, anybody know how big it is? Well, most fungal spores sort of land in the 3 to 20 micron range. All right, how big is a micron? 1,000th of a millimeter. So these are tiny, tiny, tiny little structures. And they actually have to push through the air with that crazy G-force. But then it slows down before it smashes into the other gill. The spores in the gill have different static electric charges, so it sort of bounces between the two gills and falls out. And ideally, the shape of a mushroom's cap is kind of like an airplane wing, and the spores get pulled out into the environment. But in reality, 80 to 90% of the spores land within about 6 feet of the parent mushroom. So they're not that efficient at spore dispersal. So that's where other organisms that can help move spores to the landscape contribute significantly to their dispersal. That's why when you're out there picking your mushrooms, you're actually contributing, particularly if you're carrying them in open baskets. You can go to the next. So we were just talking a little bit about ants and ant fungal dispersal. Can we hide that again? It should be right over there in the more section.
What is it?
Yeah, the cursor. There you go. One more down. There you go. Perfect. All right. So there's many different species of leafcutter ants. Anybody got to actually see them in the tropics? Yeah, aren't they amazing? Just diligent little workers carrying little sections of leaves back and forth. But what many people don't realize is that ants are actually farming a fungus. These are the fungus farming ants. So if we think about ants and like a lot of social insects, the queen lays an egg, and she may lay, in the case of honeybees, it might be 1,000 eggs a day, or 1,000 eggs that she's laying daily. But that doesn't mean the organism's actually procreated. So what they actually will do is they lay queen cells, and the queens go out and they start a new colony. And one time when I was working in northern South America, I got to see a queen leafcutter ant on her just after her nuptial flight. So you see that little raw spot on her thorax? That's where she's actually removed her wings. And she's starting to dig out a little hole in the ground, and she's going to go cut her first few leaves, and she's carrying with her a fungal inoculant. Is the pointer working? Ah, all right, deal. So she's actually carrying this out. She'll cut the first few leaves, and if all goes well, she will actually establish a colony, which then will, in a few years' time, might have hundreds of thousands of workers carrying those fungal leaves back to feed the fungus. What was really interesting is the indigenous folks that I was with would wake up at 3 a.m. and go out to where they could tell based on the climatic conditions when the queens were going to start emerging on the nuptial flights. And they'd pick 5-gallon buckets full of these queen leafcutter ants to cook up. And they were rich in that sort of fungal inoculum they had in their gut. And they were kind of a little bit like buttered popcorn, quite a lovely little treat. But it's crazy. I think many of us are just starting to figure out how to farm mushrooms. I mean, you might go to Sam's workshop in a few days and do the oyster mushrooms. But leafcutter ants, they've been doing it for a lot longer than us. Go on to the next one.
I guess the people were farming the mushroom farm.
Oh, now this clicker is working. Huh. What was that? The people were farming the what?
The mushroom farm.
Yes, exactly. The people were farming the mushroom farmers, exactly. So then another interesting group of fungal ant, or these are in cases, are termite associates. These are anybody know this group? Those of you that are literate, termitomyces.
Oh,
So termitomyces, these associate with termites, and they have a similar type of association. And in some parts of the world, the termites carry the inoculum with them, in other places they don't. So like Madagascar has termite-associated fungi, but those are the ones that are actually carried with them, because these other ones, they can move into an area, there's existing spore banks, and they can start the colonies. And they are one of the favorite edible mushrooms anywhere you go in the regions where they occur. There's one in some parts of the Miamba woodlands in Africa that can be 3 feet across, a single cap. It's one of the largest terrestrial mushrooms. Anybody gotten to see the mushroom Microscope titans? It's made where did you see it, Sam? And how big was that one?
It was still small.
Caps like that?
But it wasn't
Giant one. So what's interesting is the Microscope titans has been moving north in recent years. In the last decade or so, it's been reported all the way into like Durham and the Piedmont of North Carolina. But it was previously considered mostly a Mexican, Central American, and South American species. And it's very variable in the size. Sometimes it's small, like what Sam said, and sometimes it's almost a foot across. In South America, it's almost universally discussed that it's associated with social insects. But in North America, there's very little clarity on that, sort of north of Mexico, its association. And what's interesting is you look at terrestrial mushrooms, the mushrooms that are growing on the soil rather than ones that grow on wood. Generally, to get really large sizes, it is dependent on an insect to help them with producing sugar. And that's where they can get that nutrient to be able to produce such large fruiting bodies. And we'll delve into that a little bit more. So this is a Bantu man that I worked with in Cameroon, and he and some of his local neighbors love to harvest this termitomyces, and they'd grab it and very excitedly pull up the roots. And sometimes they're called eradicating root, would sometimes be 3 feet down into the ground. Just wild, down to the buried termite colonies underneath. This is an Asian species, but generally termitomyces is just found in Africa, Asia. But then other parts of the world, like this is one of the giant Australian termites. They produce these giant colonies that come out of the sort of savanna country. And for those of you that are familiar with mushrooms, you may have heard of this genus Podaxis. It's mostly found in the deserts of the world, anywhere from the southwestern U.S. all the way through deserts in South America, deserts in Africa, deserts in Australia, deserts in Asia. But in Australia, they have this really interesting species that only associates with termites. And it may be in wet savanna habitat, but you'll sometimes find these same species of termites make this really large mound. You'll see these podaxis sprouting out of it. And the ecology and the natural history of how these termite-associated podaxis is very, very poorly studied. And a lot of speculation about it, but not a lot of hard data on that. Any questions or comments about any of this? Yes. So the reason it has a root is because of that species of termite that it associates with lives deep under the soil. So the colony will be down sometimes 2, 3, 4 feet down. And so the fungus, in order to get up and get its spores dispersed into the air, has to have a long radicating root. And it doesn't, because there's no reproductive structure on that stem, it doesn't want to waste it by making a big, thick stem. It wants to use the sort of minimum amount of mycelium to get up and break the soil to then make a cap that then can produce spores. Whereas like in the same region in Africa, you can find ones that grow just off of the fully above ground termite, not hypogeous termite colonies. And above ground, they'll just have little short stems on them, nothing particularly, they look like a normal mushroom. Yeah, any other, yes. That's a great question. And there's some ambiguity on what exactly going on. My understanding of the current research on that is that, so the termites, what are the main things that termites feeding on? Wood. So they have a lot of byproduct wood that's left over. Some of the fungi may actually help the termites with breaking down the wood. There's some speculation around that. But some of them, they probably, the ones that are actually carrying the fungus with them, they probably have a very, very close dependency on that. Whereas other ones, the fungus might just be an opportunist. That's once the termites are getting towards the end of their colony, they're just capitalizing on the leftover cellulose. And basically the same as you got fungi that decompose dung or decompose other substrates. It's just like, here's a very specific niche and we can work from there. Yes. Sure.
So what was the original question?
Why do they have a long radicating root?
Ah.
And then why do termites have their, or why are the fungi growing inside of termite colonies?
Great, thank you.
Sorry if I was paraphrasing your question, but has anybody come across this false turkey tail? Yes? Yeah. This is a really interesting one because this false turkey tail, and again, those of you that are interested in hunting turkey tails for medicine, this isn't mistaking this one for the true turkey tail isn't going to kill you. This just the research hasn't shown it to have the same bioactive compounds. That's a whole different question and conversation about the medicinal properties, and we're not necessarily getting into how to tell them apart. But true turkey tails have really obvious, clean, clear pores. They're very, very even and symmetrical around, whereas these pores you can see are much sort of more irregular. But that aside, what's really interesting about this fungus is it has a close association with the pigeon trimex wasp. Now, I've looked for this wasp for years and I've yet to actually find it in the wild. So I had to go to an entomological collection to take this picture. But this pigeon trimex wasp, just similar to how the termites and the leafcutter ants carry fungal inoculum in their bodies, this one carries a fungal inoculum that it drills into the wood. It helps inoculate that fungus into the logs, that then its larva will feed off of that mycelial-rich wood and will grow from there. Now, that sounds pretty cool and interconnected, right? But there's a whole other level to the story. So there's another wasp. This is called the giant ichneumon wasp. And the giant ichneumon wasp, anybody got to see these? All right, I got another giant ichneumon wasp lover in the audience. What a deal. So giant ichneumon wasps, they're quite large, and you'll sometimes see them flying through the forest. They're quite awkward, like if you've ever seen a peacock fly, because the females have this large sort of drilling rig behind her. The technical term for this is an ovipositor. So it's designed for laying eggs. And these are sort of like, to simplify, those of you that are real entomologists, pardon my simplification of entomological terms, these are like stabilizing rigs for the drilling rig. And a few different times I've gotten to actually watch this. So what this giant ichneumon wasp does is she finds the larva of the pigeon trimex in the rotting wood. She can actually sense them with the base of her feet. So she's basically listening with her toes. And she can hear where they are, and then she bends her body in this J shape, contorts her abdomen like a little yogi, and bends the abdomen all the way in there, and then parasitizes the larva of the pigeon trimex wasp that's living off of the mycelium. And you'll actually watch it. So this was a series. These are taken maybe a minute or two apart, roughly, that I got to watch this female giant ichneumon ovipositing. And so her abdomen expands. You see this small sort of yellowish structure, and then it sort of balloons out, and she drills in, lays the eggs in there. And I've gone into the same logs where they had inoculated in and tried to chip in with my knife, and it was really solid wood, like hard to get through it with a pocket knife. And yet she could work that ovipositor down through the little cracks and actually parasitize the larva of another insect. Isn't that just mind-boggling?
It is.
Ain't nature grand? So, have any of you ever rolled over a log and seen these sort of translucent little millipede-ish, centipede-ish kind of things underneath there? A few of you maybe? So for a long time, I'm still trying to learn my millipedes and learn my millipede biology a bit better. But initially, I had assumed that these were juvenile or nymph stages of one of the larger millipedes that I was more commonly acquainted with. But it turns out that this millipede is entirely a fungal feeding specialist. And they practice basically male parental care. So these are adult males caring for juvenile baby millipedes. And what they actually do is they do this thing where they basically, it's called sometimes spoking. And they look for logs that have mycelium in them, that white structure we looked at the bottom, it's breaking down the wood. And they will sort of communally spit into that spot. And that their saliva basically breaks down the enzymes, break down the mycelium, and then they communally eat back in. Like that's a whole other definition for having a family supper, eh? But this is really, really common. And once you start rolling logs, I really recommend you all start paying attention to it because I almost guarantee this is probably happening in any sort of vacant lot behind your house, anywhere there's some organic matter laying on the ground. Particularly in the Southeast, this is a really common phenomenon. There's a few different species. I'm no millipede taxonomist, but the best I can work this out to be is the species down here on the lower right for you all. And it's just fascinating. And millipedes are just one of many invertebrates that are feeding on fungi. So I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about who picks this mushroom. Anybody? Honey mushroom, Armillaria. And they have these what are called bootstrap rhizomorphs, these sort of dark mycelial threads that feed the forest. Keep in mind, how many of you ever noticed black tissue in fungi? All right, maybe some of you. We'll talk some more about that. But that black tissue, fungi, like humans, produce melanin. Particularly in case of humans, it's when we're exposed to sunlight and how much time our ancestors spend in the sunlight. That can all contribute to how much melanin we produce in our skin. Fungi produce it as a defense mechanism. And sometimes it's because of light. Other times it's because of potentially caustic environmental conditions. So in the case of honey mushrooms, they produce this black melanized mycelium when they're going into, like, this is a tree that this honey mushroom was killing. And you can see the rhizomorph are running pretty far up the tree. And honey mushrooms, well, some of them are basically, they're moving by spores. They're thought to be the largest living terrestrial organism, only because a seagrass has them beat as far as area covered. What's the current estimate on size, Sam? For the honey mushroom. 2,300 acres. Certainly bigger than the biggest blue whale I can think of. So they spread out over large areas. But what they actually do, I'll get to that in a minute, is they're actually creating change in a landscape. So if you're trying to maximize board footage production of timber out of a given area, bad news. But if you're trying to manage a functional ecosystem and you want to have die-out zones, because that creates places for succession to come in. You can get grassland habitats, you can get other things, similar to how beavers will interact with the landscape. So honey mushrooms aren't inherently bad. It just depends on your outcome objectives for land management. But what was really interesting is I was doing some work in northeastern South America, and there was this really interesting little truffle. And this truffle looks like a lot of truffles. It has a black outer surface, and then you cut it open, and it's got marbling inside of it. That's the term for these sort of structures you see inside. And if you did genetics on this, it actually comes out relatively closely related to honey mushrooms. And you think, now, why might that be? Well, honey mushrooms are one of the causes of bioluminescent wood, foxfire, if any of you have seen it. These are examples of foxfire, long, slow shutter speeds to produce this, where it's actually glowing in the dark. But this mushroom, called Guyana gaster, there's not much of a common name for it, produces bioluminescent wood, is another one of the things that it does. Now, another really interesting thing is it will often cause these tree tip-ups and die-out zones. So this is Terry Hinkle in a field site in Guyana, and this log that had just tipped up looks similar to some of the damage you'll see from honey mushroom. And when you walk down the log, you'd see those truffles sometimes poking out close to the roots, sometimes even up onto the trees a little ways. And when we started looking at them when they were really old, they had termites living inside. And it seems that Guyana-gaster is exclusively termite dispersed. The termites will go in, eat them, and when you look at their digestive systems, it's just filled with Guyana-gaster spores. And then those termites are going back down into the soil, they're drilling into roots, and they're looking for any little dead zone, and that's basically a way for this fungus to move through the landscape, and it's sort of like a disease vector. Isn't that wild to think about? So two different ways and mechanisms, because often in lowland rainforests, there's not as much airflow as more open woodlands. So that might be one of the reasons that it's evolved into having this more sequestrating, closed fruiting morphology, because then it can use insects to help move it through the landscape. Any questions on that? You all following all right? It's nerdy enough? Too nerdy? How we doing? Okay. All right. Have any of you ever seen the beach blight aphids when you walk up to them and they all start dancing? I recommend doing it. Sort of late summer, early fall, you'll see these white clusters of insects, and if you sneak up to them and you go like that, they'll all start wiggling all at once. And what's also really interesting is if you put your arm underneath them, they're actually raining down sugar. And you may get these little clear droplets, and if you taste it, it's sweet. And eating aphid juice might not be your fancy, which is fine, but no judgment there. But if you look, you'll often see these sort of gray zones on the soil underneath them. And that's because they have their little proboscis. Proboscis is kind of like when a mosquito sticks in you and you go, ow. And that's what they're doing with the beech tree. They're sticking their little proboscis in there, and they're pulling a lot of sugar out of the vascular system. And then they're raining the sugar down. Now, what's really fascinating is there's this entire fungal community that's called the beech blight fungus. And it starts out white and then eventually goes black. And this time of year and well into the winter, you'll often find these things look like char cloth hanging from the forest, usually beech trees. And that's all a fungus that's entirely reliant on the insect sugar that's rained out of the canopy. Isn't that wild? Trouble, yes, but maybe not detrimental, because it can be, again, just like any disease vector, you can get a situation where it's actually very detrimental to the long-term health, but generally when it's in balance, it's not going to be likely fatal to the tree. It may, but I've also seen the same limb come back multiple years. So again, it's usually not like on the terminal growth, it's usually on lower lateral limbs within sort of 15 feet of the forest floor. So if the tree loses those, I mean, it's kind of like exfoliation. We're more attached to our limbs because we only got 2 or 4 of them, depending on how you define it. But beech trees tend to have more, and they're more disposable commodities. So here's a really obscure fungus that very few people ever notice, but it's around us all the time. Anybody ever seen this thing? All right, a few of you. Septobasidium. And Septobasidium is a fungus I got really interested in. There's over 300 described species. They all look very similar. They have flat crusts that grow on wood. I once, because I really wanted to learn about the natural history of it, I got the Couch monograph on Septobasidium. And it was a 400 or 500 page tome that I had to get through interlibrary loan because, as you imagine, it's not a New York Times bestseller. And I was so excited to get to the natural history section. And unfortunately, Couch did an incredibly diligent job with the taxonomy, but covered very simply in the first 3 pages with about the extent of the natural history conversation on this. And the best I can figure out, and there hasn't been a lot of work since Couch, is that this fungus actually grows over a community of. I most commonly find it in association with black gum. In the southeast, if you find black gum and you're a betting person, you could probably put money on that there's going to be Septobasidium on the black gum. Other trees you'll find it on occasionally, but black gum is almost guaranteed to be on there. And what it actually grows over this community of scale insects, and it will kill a few individuals in the colony and then keep their proboscis intact. Because fungal cell walls, they have chitin, insect scale walls have chitin, and they use basically the whole entire scale insect's body as a proboscis to tap into the vascular system, suck the sugar out of the tree, and yet it gets into that sort of paradigm of how do you define parasitism versus symbiosis, because it kills a few members of the colony, but as a whole, the scale insect colony gets protected from, like, say, predating birds and things like that. Because like kinglet, that's one of the main ways they get through the winter is by eating scale insects. So if you're under this little mycelial mat, does that actually improve your likelihood of reproductive success, even if, maybe your uncle pulled the short straw and didn't get to, or in this case, scale insects tend to be more female-dominant colonies, so maybe it's your aunt that pulled the short straw and she doesn't get to procreate, but all of her sisters do. It's hard to know how all that settles out. Kind of wild to think about, though, eh? So anybody found this fungus? Yeah, what did you find it under? Oh, there are some literate folks in the audience, or maybe just observant ones. So this is sometimes called the ash tree bolete. And what's really interesting about the ash tree bolete is if you dig down under the ash tree where the bolete is fruiting, and sometimes you'll find tangled up in the mycelium at the base, these little black melanized sclerotia. And sclerotia is like a term for a storage organ in fungal world. And that sort of storage organ is wrapped around beach blight, around these, leaf curl ash aphids. And that aphid produces enough sugar that this fungus can grow. So these fungi don't necessarily, they're sort of the exception to what I was saying earlier about insect-associated fungi tend to produce very large fruiting bodies when they're generally associated with their sugar consumption. These make sort of average-sized boletes. They're not going to be taking any record. But a better example of one of the record-taking boletes is, this is the genus Flavopus. There's several species. This is an Australian species. There's several in Asia and Africa. And they have some of the heaviest fruiting bodies of any terrestrial mushroom. So just to give you perspective, this mushroom right here, I'll put it in scale. And this is a large one. This isn't a record. And the crazy thing is, like this button, we picked it and cooked it for several meals because it was so thick and heavy. But these will grow in association with mealybugs. And these are two photos I took from this paper that shows how the mealybugs are living basically alongside the root. And this is sort of a fungal melanized zone around the root. In many ways, those of you that are familiar with mycorrhizae, it's sort of a similar growth habit where they're growing around the root of the mushroom, or sorry, around the root of the tree. And they're getting sugars from that and then can produce these absolutely enormous fruiting bodies. Well, the current understanding is no, they don't. But generally, fungi don't like to fit into boxes. So it wouldn't surprise me if one day with better isotope tracking and better tech, we find out that they are doing some mycorrhizal associations. But there is some evidence because of the fungal bug associations, in this case, the mealybug associations, that there's actually some conservation issues around this, because in some parts of Asia, it's such a desired food, whereas most mycorrhizal mushrooms, you don't see any issues of depletion in harvesting. So it's probably something that it has a more specialized association than just mycorrhizae. Huh, we got some interesting technical. Oh, look at that. It came back. What a deal. I didn't have time to stress about that. All right, so let's take a moment and change course. We were talking about things that are sort of strictly more in the symbiotic realm of things. Let's talk about things that sort of fall closer to the more parasitic end of the spectrum. Has anybody had the opportunity to find a zombie ant? All right, a few zombie ant hunters out there. So these fungi, in the case of the ant associate ones, they generally get into a colony. As we learned in the last few years, socially transmitted diseases, they happen a lot, particularly when organisms interact. And ants, they're sort of the ultimate social beings, because they don't communicate with language, they communicate with pheromones. So they're generally exchanging all sorts of aromatic compounds, they're exchanging juices, and they're basically a perfect area for communicable diseases to spread. So with these, in some cases, in some of the colonies, like some of the species we can get even in the southeast, the ants, if one member of the colony detects the behavior of an infected individual within the colony, they'll take that individual out and they'll kill that individual and then kill themselves because they had exposure to that. Ultimate taking one for the team, right? And now y'all are supposed to ask, how does the ant kill itself? Well, they can actually bend forward and clip the section between their thorax and abdomen. So pretty wild to think about that's going on. Now, ants aren't the only one that does that. Here's a little splattering of examples of different insects that have fallen victim. This has been getting a lot of coverage lately, and there's a lot more mycologists interested in it, so I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole, or shall we say insect hole. But to find them, you got to think like a dying bug. And if you slow down and pay attention to things in the environment around you, we have in the southeast one of the best regions for biodiversity in the temperate world for these insect pathogens. Between sort of North Georgia and West Virginia, you could probably find, if you were really persistent about it, at least 40 to 50 morpho species. And if you got into genetics, who knows how many. So they're really, really quite diverse in this region. So I recommend you all get out and look for them. And one little bit that I would like to say, because these are super cool to find and super amazing to look at, but to give you a little bit of sort of ecological background on them, think about how the fungus actually gets into the insect. And there's been many different conversations around this and a lot of question marks. Some of it is because they're actually spores landing in the environment when insects are going to their dormant phase. Maybe there's mycelia in the soil that can then parasitize them. Some of them now, some of the research is indicating they might actually be endophytes, so meaning they're occurring in the plant. And then the insect comes along, browses on the plant, and when the insect populations maybe get too out of hand and are predating too much on the plants will pump more sugar to their endophytes, which in this case might be these fungi, and then they will start parasitizing some of the insects that are predating the colony. So it's an interesting way to think about like this sort of biocontrol on a functional ecosystem level, that like an insect gets too out of hand, they may just say, all right, let's slow down this population of X, Y, or Z, whatever the insect is. It's pretty wild to think about, right? And also, some of them are showing really interesting promise for mycomedicinals. So this one right here is the source for cyclosporin, which is one of the early immunosuppressants that made organ transplants possible. So they have a lot of really interesting secondary metabolites and things going on. The biochemistry of this group is a bit of a gold mine if you're a biochemist. Here's a few other examples. These are southeastern ones. This species and this species were described in the last sort of 8 years. That's how new. This is still one quite common in the southeast that's undescribed. It grows on Carolina leaf roller crickets, and you'll see these fruiting bodies sticking out. And this one I'll put out there, it's only been found to be in the asexual stage. So keep your eye out if you see any that have like little pimply growths on them. It's very much worth saving them and drying them. Because there's an undescribed species in there that needs to be named, and it's hard to name it without the sexual stage. All right, so how folks feeling? Following any other invertebrate questions? We might delve down the vertebrate train. We got some time. So I like to put this slide up because what do these three organisms have in common and associations, and how do their ecologies and natural histories and life histories overlap? A tree? Yep. Trees. I like this. Shall we go to the next slide? So how many of you ever seen a squirrel chew a hole in a tree? Big enough to live in. But how many of you ever seen a squirrel living in a hole in a tree?
Yeah.
Right? So let's take a minute and sort of reverse engineer how that hole got into the landscape. Well, fungi function in many different ways. And those other fungi we were talking about earlier are sort of generally more specific niches that they're holding. There's a lot of other fungi that are more generalists. And one of the sort of generalist habits of fungi is decomposers. There's many different fungi that break down organic matters. Break down organic matter. And there's two main ways that fungi break this down. One is, who's ever seen sort of brown rotting logs in the forest? All right. Anybody know what that's called? Brown rot. So they pull out the brown rot, and that's basically where fungi are breaking down the cellulose and they're leaving behind lignin. Now, the other main one is, anybody want to guess? White rot. Yes. And what is the white rot breaking down? The lignin. And so they break down the lignin, and I'm no biochemist, but chemist friends of mine tell me that brown rot and the lignin that's left behind, lignin is one of the harder organic things to break down. So it's been carbon dated in landscape to sometimes be over 250 years old if it hasn't been exposed to fire. So it works and holds nutrients in the soil for a very long time. These fungi are cycling through vast quantities of organic matter that would just build up. You can think about the organic matter buildup if fungi weren't breaking it down around us. But then within the brown rot and white rot, there's fungi that specialize only on roots, only on hearts, only on butts. You know, I know some people like that. And they're specializing on only breaking down certain aspects of a tree. So in the case of, you ever see a tree that just falls over and you're like, wow, why did it break right there at the soil line? That's probably because it had a butt rot in it. Or if you've seen one that just tipped up with the roots, now it could be a large wind event or other things, but if you look at the roots and there's like some rot in them and the roots sort of look like they had bad structural integrity, it's probably because it was a root rot. And then how many of you have seen a hollow tree? Right? A hollow tree because it had a heart rot. So I'm just painting big, broad brush strokes here about sort of how these fungi are breaking down. But when we look into this, what's really interesting is, for example, this is a relatively common polypore that you see on oak trees, and it's a heart rot. So it's breaking down the center part of a tree. So you think about it, you cut a tree down and you see that brown section in the middle, that's mostly the heartwood. Metabolically, that's the least active part of a tree. That outer margin where the bark is, and then it goes into sort of the whiter, usually not always whiter, but usually pale colored wood compared to the heartwood. That's the most actively growing part, and that's the most physiologically active part. So that's the hardest part for the fungi to get through. But once they can get through and get into the heart rod, then they can start breaking down that inner wood. What's really interesting is then things like woodpeckers come along. Now, woodpeckers, aren't they just a miraculous being? They basically have a jackhammer for a face, and they can sidle up to a tree, and they can detect somehow through the bark that that tree has a rotten heart. And then they just proceed to beat their face against the tree until they can very detailedly cut a hole into the middle and excavate out the heart rot, because woodpeckers disproportionately choose trees that have heart rots in them. And then they'll excavate out those hearts. Now, what's really interesting is many of the fungi that produce the heart rots have a lot of bioactive compounds in their mycelium. The same reason we're interested in them for medicine, because they have things that are like antibacterial compounds, antiviral compounds, cytotoxic compounds. Cytotoxic meaning it kills mites. And so then the woodpecker is raising its nestlings in a little mycelial engulfed hunk of wood inside of a rotting tree. And often that outer edge, like where the squirrel's peeking out of, this live oak, this was originally a woodpecker excavated cavity. But then woodpeckers have this really peculiar habit of they have terrible nest hygiene. So not all species of woodpeckers, there's 230 or so species worldwide, but many of them don't actually carry out the poop from their babies, where most birds will carry the poop away. Like where I'm from in Western North Carolina, there's an expression, woodpeckers are called peckerwoods. And there's an expression that loggers will often say, why, that's as stanky as a peckerwood nest. And that's referring to the fact that the poop will build up in there. Well, what's really interesting is that's why you'll often see a woodpecker hole just around the same tree, but like a few feet away, because they're choosing the same tree that has the same heart rot. But because they don't reuse the cavities, that opens it up for many other animals, such as squirrels and many, many birds. So you think about owls and lots of other animals, flying squirrels. They all depend on those cavities excavated by birds. And it's interesting, the only large land masses in the world that don't have woodpeckers are New Guinea, New Zealand, and Australia. And they have the highest diversity of parrots. And parrots, though they don't have pointy beaks, they will chip away really slowly and can tear into trees and start to excavate out. But they are really dependent on heart rot woods. So it's really interesting to think about how that plays out. So, for example, here's some parrots living in a colony. And what's really fascinating, anybody who's been into mushrooms a little while probably recognizes this genus name as chicken of the woods, Laetoporus. And the Australian Laetoporus grows on eucalyptus trees and will break down the heart rot in the eucalyptus trees and then make room for, like, this is a type of parrot, this is a rainbow lorikeet that's living inside of an old hollowed out eucalyptus limb, likely because of a fungus, either this fungus or a closely related one. And you notice how this fungus is covered in all these little white powdery spots? That's because there's wood-boring beetles that are then living inside of that fungus, and then they're dispersing those beetles back into the trees and helping to spread the fungal rot to the landscape. So from a logger's perspective, these are hazard trees. From a functional ecosystem standpoint, these are really, really, really integral to a functional ecosystem, because the fungi that are engineering the heart cavity rots are basically creating a long-term healthy functional landscape, because not only the woodpeckers are going to clear out those cavities, but then many other organisms will follow up and use those cavities in the future. And it also makes me wonder, when we construct wooden boxes that don't have heart rot in them, what are we giving our animals that we're trying to get move into them a disservice, because they don't have that sort of microbiome that their wild dwelling cousins have. So any questions or additions about that? All right, folks must be falling asleep. So this is a really interesting one. This is sometimes, again, another very overlooked fungus. It's often called the glue crust. And what it actually does is takes rotting sticks and attaches them to trees and will continue to grow through the forest. And so you'll see these, like, this is not a stick I balanced here. You could pull on this and the whole tree that's holding it up will move back and forth. And what's really interesting is you think about it as fungi have to expose to the same competitive ecosystems as plants are. And so it's not always as obvious, because many fungi are living in the soil and then those mycorrhizal filaments, so we can't see how they're competing and interacting with other organisms. But these fungi hold a niche by basically being able to decompose things before they ever hit to the forest floor. So they're gluing them in place. But then the interesting thing is many birds will come along and collect these, use them in their nests, and they will glue their nests in place. And then as the nestlings and the babies get fatter, those nests will actually sustain the weight of the growing babies. And in some parts of the world, particularly in the wet tropics, it's been shown that if the birds have selected this or related litter trapping fungi into their nests, they will have a disproportionately higher rate of nestling survival as ones that have not been raised in those nests. So another example are litter. These are another group, like if any of you are familiar with marasmias, see all these twigs are just sort of stuck in the trees? That's because this is a whole section that fell out of the canopy and got hung partly on the way to the ground. And that's actually another type of litter trap fungus. And if you look at them closely, you'll see the little fruiting bodies. These are tiny. This is a species from North Florida. You'd probably get it well into Georgia. This is a species from tropical Australia. This is a cosmopolitan group all the way into the northern woods. You'll find them, but they tend to be most common in wet tropics and wetter forests. So anybody found out the compound that makes that glue? So in this case, they're basically just as if you imagine taking a sewing thread and waving it through the forest. These aren't as much glue. The other ones, they're basically gluing with mycelium. So they're using the same structures that they would take to break down wood, but they tend to be dark colored, just like these are black. And that's because they have a lot of melanin in them because they're exposed to, just like there's cactuses that live in the lowland forest, rainforest, but they're arboreal cactuses because they get low rainfall for the rainforest, but because they live in the canopy, they don't get as much rain as if they were on the ground. Make sense? So it's a relatively dry, hostile environment for a fungus in the canopy, relatively speaking. And so they can protect themselves from drying out by having that sort of thick melanized layer on the outside. Does that answer your question? So for this one, it's a net. The other one's more of a glue. Yes, and some of these, what's really interesting is they'll weave into nests. So this is a nest I found in Western Carolina. It was overhanging a pond, and you can see the rhizomorphs, which is what these are called, rhizo meaning like root and morph meaning root formed. They're actually wrapped around this twig and growing through it, and you can see they were alive. And some of them have actually never been seen to fruit and are thought to be entirely dispersed by birds and move through the landscape and gluing things together. Isn't that wild? So I urge you to look for it. I went through the literature pretty methodically because I wanted to see how widely this was occurring, and I came up with 275 different bird species around the world that do this, and that is so far from complete, it's not even funny because there's so many ornithologists that will list nesting material, and they'll say, and then we were in the middle of some remote rainforest, and we don't know where the nearest horses were, but we found horses in the nest, and some of it was forking, which was weird. Because horsehair doesn't fork, and it's very obviously that it's the rhizomorphs. So it's just an interesting thing to pay attention to. And if you start looking, many birds around here are using it to some degree. All right, so I want to switch gears a little bit and talk more about vertebrates that eat fungi. So for those of you that are new to mushrooms, you've probably heard the term mycorrhizae. And mycorrhizae in itself would merit a whole talk onto its own, but we don't have time for that. So I'm just gonna give you the crash course in it. Myco, fungus, rhizae, root. Literally means fungus root. Trees photosynthesize, they produce sugars, and sugars, think of it as the currency of the natural world. Depending on what a fungus is giving to them, they may give them more or less sugar. So if it's in a nutrient poor landscape, they generally will pump a lot of sugar to their fungi because the trees are having trouble absorbing the nutrients out of the soil. The fungus, it comes around, it envelops the root. In the case of a lot of the mushrooms we interact, this is called ectomycorrhizae because it happens externally. There's many other fungi that do their mycorrhizal associations internally. Those are generally soil fungi. They're microscopic. You're not going to see them unless you sift soil. So generally what I'm saying in this evening is going to reference the ecto ones. So external, the fungus, because it has those filaments, the mycelium we talked about at the beginning, they're very efficient at pulling nutrients out of the soil. They help the trees with their uptake of water, phosphorus, nitrogen. The list goes on and on and on. Basically, trees would struggle to survive in the landscape that they live in if it wasn't for their fungal symbionts. 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet depend on these types of associations. Any questions about that? So we see that happening. So we have the forests with the trees that have their fungal associates, and then we have fungi that are associated with them. What's really interesting is in many landscapes, truffles or so-called sequestrate, meaning enclosed. It's a term that came out of economics. It's basically an enclosed system. So we're looking at sequestered fungi. So they have a skin that never opens. So something like a stinkhorn, it has a sequestrate stage because it starts out in an egg, but then eventually that ruptures and is external. So that's not a sequestrate fungus in the strict sense of the word. Whereas truffles, there is about as textbook classic example of a sequestrate fungus as you can get. They live their entire life enclosed in a skin, and in their case, they're sequestrate and they're hypogeous, meaning they're below ground. And so they are entirely reliant on organisms to move them through the landscape. Because that whole cool ballistospory, the forcible discharge, the G-force of 10,000 that we talked about at the beginning, not relevant to them, even if they can do it, because there's no place for their spores to go because they're fully enclosed in the skin. Everybody follow me all right? So they are reliant on animals to ingest them. And then animals, they eat something, and then what happens? They poop it. Thank you. You saved me from having to talk about that. And it turns out that the spores are moved to the landscape by these animals. Now, we talked earlier, 80 to 90% of the spores land within 6 feet of the parent mushroom. So not that efficient, the forcible discharge. When you think about it, even a slug could contribute significantly to long-distance spore dispersal if 80 to 90% move beyond the fruiting body. Okay, so let's delve into this a little bit. What's really interesting is how often have you noticed that the reproductive tissues of the fungi get disproportionately eaten? Right? You'll notice that. And that's because the fungi are nutritionally incentivizing organisms to eat that. And when you think about it, just like if you're going to eat an apple, that doesn't mean eat the apple tree or eat the stem. That means eating the apple. We're incentivized to eat certain parts of the fruit. And so the fungi are doing the similar thing. So you'll often see like these are cute little tiny cup fungus, often called eyelash cups, because you see little lashes around there, or scutellaria if you want to be technical. And you see that little bald spot in the middle. That's where this slug has come along and just absolutely chowed down. And these russulas, same sort of thing. And then this hygrophorus down here, you notice how all the gills are gone. Or if we're going to be technical, the lamellae. Can you all say that word? Isn't that a fun one? Lamellae. Does that feel good on your tongue? So they ate all the lamellae off there. And then here's 2 truffles that have been absolutely obliterated by springtails. But you notice they didn't touch the peridium. The peridium, that's the mycological term for the rind. These little fussy springtails didn't eat the rind of their truffle. And you look at there, see their brown stripe down the back? That's actually not a stripe. That's their digestive tract, just filled with the brown spores. And then if we move over here to vertebrate land, you can see here's, anybody eat this mushroom? Lactarius carugus or Lactifluus carugus, one of my favorite leatherbacks. And you look it over, look at the squirrel, beat me to it. All the gills gone. And the same sort of thing we're seeing here, this bolete, they peeled off all the pore surfaces. This Amanita jacksonii, the caps are gone. Look here, Ichnoderma, there's a browse line. Just like trees get a browse line, mushrooms get a browse line. The deer ate all the way up to about there and then didn't feel like standing on their hind legs to reach higher. So these are fungi that have incentivized animals to eat their reproductive parts, which increases spore dispersal. So how does this shape the trajectory of fungi and their growth forms? Well, what's really interesting is many fungi actually, the rate of germination increases with transit through an animal's digestive system. So the gastrointestinal sort of enzymatic tribulations of the digestive system actually scarifies the spores, just like we know many seeds, you have to scarify them to get them to germinate. So that doesn't mean that all fungal consumers are created equal. So for example, a slug has a more corrosive digestive system than a mouse. So that actually spores will germinate quicker and at a higher rate out of a slug than they will out of a mouse. But that doesn't mean that a mouse doesn't also, doesn't mean that it reduces viability. It just doesn't alleviate dormancy as much as a slug does. And the same thing, a pig will scarify spores more than a mouse will. So you look at that and you can see how that shapes. Now, what's really interesting is when you think about normal mushroom fruiting bodies, quote unquote, what does normal mushroom fruiting body mean? But if we think about the stem and the cap sort of classic morphology, that's the stem is all wasted reproductive space. So if you can create a fungus that's totally enclosed, that means you don't have to waste all of that reproductive tissue on non-spore bearing tissue. So there was a big debate about are fungi for the most part becoming more above ground and more stem and capped, or are the stem and capped mushrooms becoming more like truffles? And this was a great debate for many years. And now molecular era has pretty well proven that these are later developments in the fungal tree of life, that they're to be enclosed and below ground and have very specialized aromas. Because here's, for example, just the diversity of truffles from different places around the world. And we look at these sort of more advanced ones, you lose these internal stems, and you end up with basically geodes that are fully enclosed spore tissues. Now you think about it, you're above ground, an animal sees you and comes and eats you and then disperses your spores. But the thing is, it might happen before the mushroom is mature. So that means the spores don't get dispersed. Or you might get a frost that kills off the mushrooms above ground. Or you might get a drying season that then kills them out above ground. But if they're below ground, they're insulated from that. But the only environment in which being sequestrate and hypogeous, meaning underground, is disadvantageous is in the wet tropics, because flooding they're not super adapted to. So generally in lowland tropics, you see a decrease in the so-called truffle morphology, whereas in drier, colder, or generally more grasslandy kind of open savanna-y woodlands, you see an increase in truffle diversity because it's an adaptation to those sorts of environments, and then having animal dispersal. Everybody following okay? Okay, so what does this actually look like? Well, here are in the northern hemisphere, or let's see, southern hemisphere, we have this amazing family called the Mesophelaceae. This is the genus Mesophilia. This is Andebia. But then in North America, we have Elaphomyces. Elaphomyces, there's probably 40 species in eastern North America. And many people never notice Elaphomyces, but I guarantee you've walked past them. Sometimes if you look on logs, you'll see these black powdery sections. And that's where a squirrel has dug up, or a mouse has dug up a truffle, sat on the log, shucked it. And in this case, they incentivize them to eat the outer edge, basically peel off the rind. They'll eat some of the spores in the process, but they leave some of the spores on the log. That way the fungus is sort of taking its chances. It can get some by wind dispersal. The spores are hydrophobic, so when water hits them, they react to the water and get moved. But then also some of them are getting ingested and moved through the animal's scats. And you'll often see these digs. Like here's a truffle that was left in place. Probably something like a mouse or a chipmunk or a vole took a few little nibbles out of the skin and then didn't quite finish its meal. And here's one that ate some of the outer skin. Now, what's interesting is in the southern hemisphere, if we jump over here to the other side of the world, these have almost no rind. It's basically all dirt and mycelium. And then inside of it, this greenish layer is where the spores are, and then it has an edible core in the very middle. So the animals shuck it, and then they eat the core on the inside, and then they pop off through the forest like little powder puffs, dispersing spores as they go. What's really interesting is this group is predominantly associated with eucalyptus. What do we know about eucalyptus? It's smelly. What else? Healing properties. So for those of you that are on Zoom, healing properties and smelly are two things we've gotten. Burns a lot. That's the one that I was going for. Eucalyptus produce a huge amount of oils in their leaves. Those leaves fall into the fire, and it's basically a virtual tinderbox. And they burn. Well, this fungus is specifically adapted to wildfire. And when it gets burned, there's some fruit bodies that were close to the surface. They got cooked. Not very impactful. But then when they're several inches down and they get exposed to heat, they smell like rotting onions. And animals come in from everywhere. So I was living in Australia when they had the big black summer fires that burned out huge swaths of Australia. And I spent 2 weeks on the fire front because we were living very close to that. And I was going back into an area that had just burned. And then there was we saw from satellite imagery, another fire had started up. So we went back in to try to put this out. It was just absolutely scorched earth, no leaf litter. Everything had just burned up because of eucalyptus. But then I noticed right within 30 feet of the fire that we went to put back out, there was a spot that had freshly been dug. And you notice right here, these are mesophilias that had already been dug out by an animal. There's no other forage around. And this truffle is entirely dependent on those animals to disperse them. And it's particularly sitting under the soil for the right time. When a fire comes through, those animals come eat it. And then that soil has totally been burned off. It's a great time for those spores to get down to that mycelial layer. A lot of the eucalyptus seedlings are designed for having fire germination. And so when that fire lights up, those seeds will come up and start sprouting afterwards. And then there's spores deposited all through the animal scats, all through the environment around them. So you can see this sort of co-adaptation between the different groups of organisms. Not the only ones. These are all southeastern Elaphomyces that you could find within an hour or two drive of here. Just to give you an idea, But I want to delve in a little bit more onto, onto what you find with these Elaphomyces. So, for example, I recommend looking for these little dark spots because this is a example of a squirrel dropping backwash. So a squirrel ate an Elaphomyces, and then also, I don't know which happened first, but then started also eating this Boletus. And you can see it left spore residue that I put under the microscope, and sure enough, it's got Elaphomyces spores on it. But they're just moving them widely through the landscape. And if you find those black powdery spots, pick them and rub them between your fingers because Elaphomyces have relatively large spores. They're sort of in the 20 to 35 micron range, and they sort of feel like chalky velvet. And you can tell that they are those spores. So Elaphomyces are eaten all over the world. This is a Baka pygmy fellow that I spent time with in Cameroon, and he had just caught this West African brush-tailed porcupine in his trap, and I asked him if I could have the gut contents. And when I put the gut contents under the microscope, it was filled with Elaphomyces spores. And they were, to us as outsiders, undescribed species at that time that were living in the same habitat, and those West African brush-tailed porcupines it was a major staple in their diet. So how widespread is this? Many, many, many animals around the world eat large numbers of fungi. Here's a Eastern European hedgehog that I ran across in Turkey, and I got some scats from it, and they were full of rhizopogon spores. And rhizopogons, they associate with pines, and I guarantee they're found within 100 yards of where we're sitting right now. One of the interesting things is many of the fungal spores, like we saw on the Elaphomyces, that tend to be considered animal dispersed spores, they often have very thick spore walls, and they're very dark. They have a lot of melanin in the spore itself. And some people say that's an adaptation to animal digestive systems because the scarification of those spores will survive better if they have a thicker spore wall. But what's really interesting is rhizopogons are one of the better studied groups. And you see they have very small, very thin-walled, clear spores. And I've gone through all the literature I could find on spore viability, and I found nothing to indicate that any of the animals that ingest fungal spores, at least on macro invertebrates and vertebrates, actually detrimentally impact their spore viability. So it seems like the thick spore wall may be true for some groups, but it's not across the board. So primates, they also eat a huge amount of fungi. I know that some of you all, being primates in this group, probably ingest the mushrooms as well. We did a fun project with this truffle that was collected by primatologists after noticing bonobos were eating it. And it turned out that it was an undescribed species to Western science. So we call it a Hystrangium bonobo in honor of the bonobos that found it. But indigenous folks in the region were also using these and closely related truffles to bait traps in order to catch other wildlife because they're so integral and important to wildlife diets. And there's amazing studies that talk about how the bonobos actually find the truffles, that they'll actually work their fingers into the soil and sniff their fingers to try to determine where the truffles are to then be able to locate them. So it's wild to think about. I've seen some human truffle hunters do similar behaviors. So I was interested to see how widespread fungal consumption was. And if we look at it globally, we can see these are different groups of mammals. There's lots of different groups for those of you that aren't super into mammal taxonomy. The gray zones, that's rodents. And rodents are really, really important in the landscape as far as fungal dispersal goes. But also groups like carnivora, which is big apex predators. So things like polar bears, black bears, they eat lots of fungi as well. And think of it, because a lot of fungi, let's see, I'll go to this slide for a minute. We look at this is the sort of percentage of species reported to consume per group. And we look at something like, where's our rodents here? Rodents, 221 species, but that's less than 10% of rodent species have actually been thoroughly studied to show that they're eating it. But then things like primates, 104 species, but that's also a sampling bias because a lot of people want to go study primates, but less people are excited to go study small mice. But what's really interesting is fungal nutrition. Fungi are really important to wildlife. They can get a lot of things like selenium. That's a compound that's really hard for animals to get from plant products. So selenium, if animals are deficient in that, if any of you raise livestock, you'll know that you can get something called white muscle syndrome. which is a selenium deficiency, which causes all sorts of health problems for livestock. So for large animals like polar bears or elk or deer or things like that, it may not be, deer eat a lot of fungi, but a lot of the other larger animals, they may be using them as sort of their, let's go to the nutritional cabinet and get out a few multivitamins. They may not be the biomass, but they may be giving them micronutrients they can't get from other food. Whereas things like rodents, 80 to 90% of their diet can be a fungus. And they will often balance their diet with multiple different fungi. So the California redback vole, small little rodent, it will sometimes have 8 to 9 different genera of fungi in its digestive system at any given time, when it could have just pigged out on one mushroom and one fruiting body and filled itself up. But no, it's getting different amino acids. So that means that every little scat is like a little inoculum in the forest. And also, fungi mate throughout their lifetime. So when animals are eating them, they're then moving them through the landscape, and they're putting multiple different fruiting bodies in one site, which then gives an opportunity for fusing of mycelium and then get new genetic material and makes them more adaptable in the face of changing climate and those sorts of things. So I was interested in looking at this in Australia for one reason, because Australia, like we talked about, eucalyptus has a huge amount of oils, and those oils fall from the trees in leaves, and those leaves land on the soil. They create this hydrophobic layer where water can't get in. Well, it turns out Australia has the greatest diversity of truffles on the planet. One national park in the state of Victoria has more truffle diversity than all of Europe. So those truffle diversity is also correlated with incredible diversity of fungal feeding animals. But when those animals, mostly marsupials, things like potoroos and betongs and bandicoots and pattymellons and lots of different animals like that we don't hear about, bilbies, things like that we don't hear about in the US, but they're integral to this consumption of fungi. Yes?
How many of those names did you make up?
None of them, actually, but that's a good question. How, for those of you online, how many of those names did I make up? Oscar's just giving me a hard time. So they will eat huge diversity of truffles. Sometimes 80% of their diet is composed of truffles. And by hunting the truffles, they're digging, and they're creating a soil disturbance, which then allows for those eucalyptus leaves to be worked back into the soil. It creates micro catchments that water can land in and penetrate back in. And it's also then moving the mycelium, those mycorrhizal networks, through the soil. But with the introduction of the British, they wanted to be able to hunt foxes and cats. So they brought in foxes and cats. They obliterated most of those wild mammals. Now, from the state, conservation standpoint, not all of those are extinct. Some of them are. Not all of them are, but from an ecological standpoint, they're functionally extinct. They're no longer performing that function in the landscape because they're retained on little islands and places like that where foxes and cats didn't get to. But when you lose them from the landscape, the soil's not getting turned, then the fires burn much hotter, and it cooks the soil, dries it out, and then it actually damages the mycelium, and we see this whole landscape fall apart. We see incredible desertification. We see large washout zones where you get these were once rich, lush green grasslands where the whole soil sloughs away because when rains do come, the soil's been so compacted, not to mention a couple hundred years of sheep on the landscape. Compaction, die off of mycorrhizal communities. And so we were interested to see how Australian mammals would impact some of that. So some of the stuff we did was like, this is putting up camera traps on where amanitas were fruiting. And we had brush turkeys come along in the daytime. And then these are red-necked pattymellons. I know some people like that. This is a long-nosed potoroo. These are red-legged pattymellons. Like this one with their pouch young in tow, and a black-striped wallaby. They're all coming along eating the same set of mushrooms. Now, these are above ground, so we were able to have a camera on them. There was a cartoonist in the journal we published it in who did this little selfie thing about wildlife taking pictures of mushrooms. Hard science, But mammals aren't the only thing that do this. We see reptiles. Anybody ever seen box turtles eating mushrooms? Yes, major eaters of mushrooms. They're slow about it, but they get the job done. And interestingly enough, there's a fair bit of reports in the herpetological literature that box turtles have actually poisoned people when they eat mushrooms that are toxic. I have a little trouble believing this because there's many, many turtles eaten around the world that also eat mushrooms, and I found no reports of poisonings outside of box turtles in North America. And the exact nature of those poisonings, I don't know. Maybe it is because they're eating poisonous mushrooms. But that's a good reminder that just because wildlife can handle eating a toxic mushroom doesn't mean we can do that, because their digestive systems are very different from ours. There's a blue-tongued skink chowing down on some stinkhorns. And birds. Birds eat a lot of different mushrooms as well. These are Australian king parrots eating Citeria, which is an amazing southern beach-associated fungus. And this fungus actually has relatively high sugar contents. But birds tend to be more visually cued, whereas mammals tend to be more olfactory cued. So the selective pressures are different from bird use of fungi. So in Australia, maybe some of you have heard of the satin bowerbird. Any of you, or heard of bowerbirds in general? Bowerbirds, to give you a crash course in bowerbird biology, young male bowerbirds take about 7 years to find a mate because they have to learn from all the older males. And they construct these elaborate bowers, often with sticks, sometimes 3-4 feet tall, depending on the species of bowerbird. And they collect lots of different colored objects. And different bowerbird species, the ladies, have different selective pressures. So selective pressures for peacocks produce crazy tails. Selective pressures for bowerbirds produce crazy courtship behaviors. So 7 years, a male will sometimes work on perfecting a bower before he seduces a mate. Well, I've actually found the bluet mushrooms inside of satin bowerbird bowers because he was interested in the blue fruiting bodies. And the Australian species of bluets tend to be a little darker in color, and I can't help but wonder if satin bowerbird had something to do with that. Here's a satin bowerbird bower, for example. This one doesn't have any mushrooms in it, but you can see it's collected parrot feathers and Sharpie caps, bottle caps. Often there's a clothespin. And then he took hundreds of sticks and stuck them in like this. And this is a relatively simple bower building species. So the small mammals, they might turn over 7 or 8 tons of soil. This is an example of where a lyrebird has come through the forest. And you can see it looks like a rototiller has come through there. Brush American turkeys do similar things. Lyrebirds, I think it's about 125 metric tons of soil estimated to turn over a year, one lyrebird. And I was interested to see if they ate truffles. So I went and spent a lot of time following lyrebirds around. And sometimes I found where they'd miss truffles in their digs. But I also collected a lot of their scats. And I found 14 different genera of truffles in their scats. So they were definitely eating them. But what's interesting is a lot of other smaller birds will follow the lyrebirds around and pick up the truffles behind them. So they're sort of the similar how you have cattle egrets that follow along behind cattle and get the insects disturbed up. The lyrebirds, they're eating some, but not all of them. What's interesting is if we jump over to New Zealand, a landscape that's, to use ecological terms, the pulpit of mammals. Basically, there's no mammals other than 2 crawling flightless bats that crawl around. And then Maori folks brought in a few other animals, and then white folks brought in even more mammals. But the landscape was totally basically developed as we see it by a bird-dominated landscape. And they have the most colorful truffles in the world. So for those of you that are fungal taxonomists, this is a group of ascomycetes, and this is an ascomycete, and everything else is basidiomycetes. But you see these brilliant colors, some of the most colorful truffles, and they tend to be less buried underground. So it seems that they're adapted to bird dispersal. It's wild to think about that might have been the simple explanation for why New Zealand has all these colorful truffles, whereas other places they tend to be more drab and more focused on olfactory cues. Has anybody gotten to see animal caching of mushrooms? Yeah? So it's interesting. Red squirrels, particularly in North America, they spend a lot of time caching mushrooms, and they'll often hang them in the trees like this. Or like this. A friend of mine actually got a robin's nest that I had. I think it was 40 different Elaphomyces fruiting bodies that a little flying squirrel or a red squirrel had cached. But then what's really interesting is those caches are really, really intensely defended. But red squirrels, they're diurnal. So things like flying squirrels will help get through the winter by stealing from the caches of red squirrels, where red squirrels will kill each other with cache ownership. But the flying squirrels can sneak in at night and get what the red squirrels aren't able to protect. This is from a cave in Ohio, and that's actually a pack rat nest that has carefully dried all these mushrooms and stashed them inside of a cave. It looks like a beautiful decoration you put in the middle of your table. Looks like a lot of russulas and lactarius, but they were pretty dried when I saw the photo, so I don't know. Yes, Andy Goldsworthy right there. Are you comparing Andy Goldsworthy's great art to a rat? I think he'd be honored. But the the interesting thing with these rodents is they'll actually learn, they often they'll hang them to dry in a forked branch and then carry them back to hide them in a nest and some place where they can do, because they will need winter stores, particularly in areas where there's deep snow, because they don't want to dig to their buried nuts and other caches. So it's important for them to have it in both. What's also interesting is depends on the climate conditions of the same species of squirrel. So you can take a European red squirrel, for example, and in some place like England, it won't cache anywhere as near as much or at all because they have wet winters. Whereas you go to Norway or Sweden and they'll cache hundreds of fruiting bodies per acre. So it's wild to think about how different that is based on the climatic conditions. So we were interested in looking at how far spores travel. So this cute little animal here on the left is anybody know it? It's a swamp wallaby. This is a small kangaroo. And swamp wallabies absolutely love truffles. I don't think you could have a twinkle in your eye like that if you didn't love truffles, you know? And they have these really stout little digging feet and short little arms, and they spend a huge amount of time bent over digging up truffles and sniffing them out. And then they disperse the spores through the landscape. So I won't spend too much time on the stats of it, but those of you that are interested in stats, read away. But for those of you that aren't, basically, we found that they would just disperse, they'd poop out the spore, all of the spores within 69 hours of ingestion. But the interesting thing is, swamp wallabies have a relatively small home range. So their maximum dispersal potential, it's less than a mile. But then we wanted to compare it just like an apex predator. So we took dingoes, for example, working in Australia, because we can compare them with swamp wallabies. And dingoes, they eat a lot of different animals. They're sort of between a coyote and a wolf as far as size go. And we found that about 1 in 4 scats contain fungi. Now, we prioritized our sampling during the maximum fruiting season. So we took 40 kilometers of transects, and dingoes love to poop along trails to mark their territories. So you could walk the 40 kilometers of trails. We cleared all the scats off of them and then came back a month later after the peak fungal season, and that's when we sampled it. And we found 14 different genera of mycorrhizal fungi were present. And based on our statistical analysis, we found that they could disperse up to 10,000 meters. So we're looking at multiple miles of spore dispersal potential. So that sort of shows us that those of you that want to look at stats, there's some more stats for you. But we found that basically when they were eating things that were known fungal consumers, so like things like bush rats and small animals that eat a lot of truffles or swamp wallabies, they were a lot more likely to have fungi in their diet, because we couldn't disprove that a dingo wouldn't also occasionally eat a truffle itself. But there was good evidence that they're primarily eating they're getting the spores in their digestive system secondarily. So then that makes you wonder, you know, and here's the dispersal curve, what we see they look like. What does that mean for spore dispersal? Well, dogs occasionally eat truffles. And for those of you that can't tell what's going on in this display, this is about $10,000 worth of black truffles. And a very proud truffle mom and some of her next generation of truffle hunting pups. But these olfactory cues are integral to shaping how trees, forests function around us. And the fungi that are under the soil, they're not only important edibles for us, but they're important for many, many different animals across the landscape. And I encourage you all to get out there and pay attention to those above ground mushrooms, but also start looking for the truffles, because it might end up leaving you like this when you have a poorly trained truffle dog. And I thought also, let's see, I'll pull that back up in a second. I want to thank you all. It's about time to wrap up. But I wanted to show you, this is a video of a highly trained truffle dog working. I don't know. There we go. I don't know if folks on Zoom can see this or not. But these dogs are trained like drug dogs, and this is a great way to see how it sort of plays out with wildlife. So she actually signaled, and things like hyenas have been noticed to walk on trail and make turns just to be able to detect the smell of a truffle, and turn 200 or 300 yards off of their normal course and start digging up truffles to be able to eat them, because that's how potent these olfactory cues are. And we know, like with orchids, that sometimes they will only associate with a specific pollinator. But in the case of these, there's aromas, we don't know how specialized they are. But truffle dogs that are trained on black truffles are less effective on finding white truffles than the dogs that are trained on training white truffles. And they only vary in aroma profiles by an atom or two. So we're talking minuscule differences in their aromatic profiles, and yet it has major implications. And I'll pull up one other fun little video, and we can wrap up if there's any other questions while this plays. Maybe I can get the video. Yeah. Mhm. Okay, so that's a great question. So for those of you online, the question is, this is a truffle getting husked by a red squirrel. Is chemical inputs, particularly anti-pesticides and things like that, impacting animal communities that eat the fungi as well as the forest communities? Yeah. Okay. So one of the best studies of that is based around radiesium poisoning. So around Chernobyl, when the basically nuclear stuff failed, they ended up releasing all these radioactive compounds into the environment, and fungi are very good at bioaccumulating. And then we started ending up with humans with radiesium poisoning because they were eating pigs and deer that were basically like eating the biggest fish in the food chain and ending up with mercury, because those animals ate a huge amount of truffle fungi, mycorrhizal mushrooms that were bioaccumulating those compounds. It ended up moving up through the food chain, and then humans were getting that. Now, again, that's detrimental to humans as well as the animals, but it's also hard to know from a wildlife perspective if lifespans of the animals are long enough to start seeing the chronic health problems that we as humans see. Within primates, probably. With among rodents, with a lifespan of 2, 3, 4 years for most rodents, some pocket rats and things get 8, 9, 10 years. We're less likely to see as much of that play out. But the reality is, it's hard to know, and all these chemical stuff that's impacting, our gut biome and all those sorts of things. How is it going to play out? And probably the simplest answer is absolutely. It's probably impacting all of that negatively. Is there good enough science to make good, clear explanations of all of that? No, but from what I'm making an educated guess on what I've read in the literature, I would say absolutely, it's a problem. Other questions? Well, y'all are a hard audience. Oh, that's a hard one. Usually whatever one I'm looking at, or whatever one I'm eating. Yes. Mm-hmm.
What about like farmer out like the bottom line get a heavy flood and we don't start seeing morale back?
Yeah. So most mushrooms don't do well in anaerobic environments. That's just the nature of fungal biology. So if it got truly anaerobic, it's hard for them to make it through. And again, like morels, there's many variables because there's a lot of evidence now that morels aren't really strictly mycorrhizal like we thought. So their environmental requirements may differ. I guess I didn't repeat that question for those of you online. Sam was asking what flooding might impact on morels and if that would be detrimental to their long-term health. And I think some of them, because they grow in flood and bottomlands, a lot of them are relatively adapted to that. But how they're adapted and whether it's anaerobic or whether they're just repopulating the area after getting flooded out, that I can't answer. I don't know. Yes.
So is there like a which truffle species from like false species or like our bird falls down slightly buried, our truffles sometimes down slightly down buried?
Yes, that's great. Right. Okay, for those of you online, stop me if I need to clarify if I didn't get your question quite right. But how do you tell a truffle from an earth ball? And do earth balls ever grow underground or more like truffles, or vice versa? Is that more or less? So think of truffle as shrub. So it's a very general term. Like you can have oak trees that produce shrub-like habits and stay small, and then you can have oak trees that are giant. So earth balls, there are earth balls that never open, and like most earth balls, I assume you're meaning like sclerodermas and things like that. So most sclerodermas, their skin iridium ruptures and the spores get dispersed by air or water or things like that. However, there are a handful of species that tend to be less commonly noticed, and they're fully underground, they stay fully enclosed, and they're entirely dependent on animal dispersal. So the term truffle or sequestrate is generally more about fruiting habit rather than taxonomy. Does that answer? Yes. Get down on your hands and knees and start sniffing. No. Yes, you can do that. Unless there are some folks that are blind and have particularly acute olfactory abilities and can find them by smell. So it's theoretically possible to train that. But for those of us that aren't equipped in that way, I recommend paying attention to animal sign, because that I found more truffles based off of following along animals, because just like we talked about, they may not totally pig out on one mushroom. So often there'll be less mature truffles in the same spot, or sometimes leftover pieces that they didn't finish. And when you start raking back the leaf litter, you'll start to see them all over. And then once you sort of get cued into the kind of environment the animals are finding them, then you can start going out with a rake. Be mindful, raking for truffles. If anybody has experience from the West Coast, that's a big no-no, because they do what's called rake rape, because there's commercial truffle harvesting out there, and they'll literally go through like pigs and just totally destroy the soil layer. When you're doing it from an ecological standpoint, you're doing a little bit here, pulling away leaves, and then rolling leaves back and going somewhere else, and you're actually aerating the soil. We're not talking about like tilling it like a garden bed. Very different in raking in that sense. But a rake is a really handy tool to sort of cover some ground and just put the leaf litter back when you're going about it. But most truffles are sort of some of them are partly exposed, but usually they're sort of between where the duff is and the mineral soil. A few species will be down in the mineral soil, but they're not generally that deep. But if you look along areas that have been washed out or trail edges, all those are sort of great environments to find them in. Yes? Yeah, well, last time I asked some old animals, they 100% attributed to that, and they tried to sell me their latest mushroom elixir. No, I mean, nutritionally, we know that mushrooms contain a lot of the amino acids. There's no reason to think that it wouldn't increase the longevity of an animal. I don't have any hard data to support that. You'd really need a lot of controlled studies of animals fed in the same conditions with the fungus and without the fungus. And we're pretty hard to determine that. But I don't see any reason it wouldn't extend longevity. Other questions? Yes. Mhm. Okay, so question being button mushrooms having carcinogens in them? All right, so yeah, so button mushrooms have a compound that's, I believe it's monomethylhydrazine, which is basically dissolved with cooking. And how detrimental it is, again, lots and lots of people eat button mushrooms raw, and who knows, there's lots of cancer, but there seems like there's a lot of other carcinogenic things in our environment. But from a wildlife perspective, I don't think there's a good enough knowledge of like different mammals and invertebrates digestive systems to know how they process that. But generally, their metabolisms are so different, and we know they can handle things that some of the really dangerous animals we cannot eat, they happily eat. So I think it's kind of like comparing. It's hard to say, this is carcinogenic to them. And like within primates, they've done pretty good studies to show like young primates will eat smaller amounts, and they seem to be learning what's going to make them sick and what's not. Like particularly with macaques, there's been a good amount of studies of that in wild populations. But with rodents, it's really unlike a lot of other animals. Primates have the luxury of, like most graduate students that work on primates in a behavioral sense, sit for hours with binoculars and note every behavior. Most other animals either can't or they aren't same kind of way, particularly rodents and the small mammals that eat huge amounts of mushrooms. So it's hard to know. Yeah. Questions, comments, additions, tangents, suggestions?
I was wondering if you could talk about your book and baskets and guide.
Yeah, some baskets, spoons, books over there. Feel free to browse if you're interested. There's Sam Thayer's Guide to Wild Edible Plants. I know it's not mushroom related, but it is the best field guide I've seen yet on wild food in North America, so I recommend browsing it. And plus, he's a brilliant writer, and it's really funny, and it's got more edible species than you can find in any other resource that I know of. So Anyways, thank you all.